Hello, everyone. Welcome to Goodbook. My name is Ken Ingold, one of the pastors here at the church at RV, and I am privileged to be your teacher today. We are in the 5th week of our history series. We've been looking at the history of the Bible, the themes of the Bible, and talking about God's story, history. We're in volume 1 right now, looking at the Old Testament. Thus far, we have broken this down into 9 chapters. We have done chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. Chapter 1 was all about the beginnings, creation to the Tower of Babel. It was Genesis 1 through 11. Chapter 2 is the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, the second half of the book of Genesis. Chapter 3 was Moses, Exodus, and the law, Exodus through Deuteronomy. And chapter 4 was the conquest of Canaan and the period of the Judges, where we looked at the books of Joshua and Judges. So we are now in chapter 5, week 5. This is the beginning of the monarchy, talking about Samuel, Saul, and David. As I shared with you last time I spoke, I really break this down into 6 segments that I want to look at, 6 facets I want to check into. We're going to look at the books of the Bible that we're discussing. We're going to talk about the time period that we're in. We're going to look at the location and circumstances. We're going to talk about the governments, what's in place at that point, what's going on in the world. What about the people? Who are we talking about? And obviously the theology. It is God's story. It is His story. So we want to talk about how God fits into this entire picture. So today we are talking about the beginning of the monarchs. We're talking about Samuel, Saul, and David. So let's jump right into that. We're talking about 1st and 2nd Samuel today. It's a narrative. Actually, if you go back to the original Hebrew script, it wasn't 1st and 2nd Samuel. It was just Samuel, the book of Samuel. It was broken down into 2 books in the Septuagint when a number of Hebrew scholars, they figure around 30 of them, got together between the 1st and 3rd century BC, and they decided to record the Hebrew scriptures in Greek. And so they broke it down into 2 books. We're not exactly sure why. It's really kind of an awkward split where they split it, but it's broken into 2 books, and so it's what we have in our Bible today. So that translation was written by those Jewish scholars. Scholars believe that 1st and 2nd Samuel, or the book of Samuel, was written by Samuel. The only problem with that is that in 1 Samuel 25, Samuel dies. So that creates a little bit of an issue. How do we write the rest of the book of Samuel if Samuel is no longer with us? So scholars believe that it was completed by the prophets of Gad and Nathan. They probably finished the book. Its final writing was probably around 925 BC, well after the time period we'll be looking at today. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then, so what this does, it continues the history of God's relationship with His people, the covenant, God's story of redemption throughout history, and the story of David's line and how that would become the line of which redemption would take place. So today we're going to talk about Samuel, Saul, and David. We're going to talk about Goliath, that fits right into this picture. Talk about Jonathan, Saul's son, David's best friend. Talk about Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan. We'll talk about Absalom. We're going to talk about the United Kingdom of Israel. The time period we're looking at runs from about 1105 BC to 970 BC. It's a 135-year story. That's what we're going to do. We're going to jump right into that story today, all right? So let's look at the world picture for a moment. That timeline, as I said, Samuel was born in 1108. We have Saul beginning his reign in 1050. King David in 1010, King Solomon in 970. We're not going to talk about King Solomon's reign today, but just to give you a picture of that timeline. And then the end of the United Kingdom in 931 or 930 is when the kingdom became divided. You look at that map of the world. You see that it's kind of an interesting time in world history. It's kind of a dark, quiet time in world history. The collapse of the Hittites took place in 1179. That's that light brown area up in the upper part of the map. So they were really no longer in power at that point. We had a significant weakening of the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. There really isn't a strong world power at this point in time. So what we're really looking at is the rise of the Phoenicians. We're looking at the rise of the Israelites, which only makes sense as we're talking about this time of the kings that God, all the focus would be on what's going on in Israel as they are rising in power and taking place. So that's kind of the picture of the world map. As we break it down from there, as I said, King Saul reign was from 1050 to 1010. That pinkish area you see there on the map is actually the area that encapsulates Saul's reign, is the property, the land mass that he had at that point. Israel entered the Promised Land around 1406 BC. So 1406 was to 1050 was the time of the judges, including Samuel. That's a big part of what Dr. Mark talked about last week. And then we move into this map of Saul's kingdom. We see as they move into the Promised Land, and when Saul becomes king, this is the land mass we're talking about. Then we move into David's reign. And so as you look at that map, you see that purple area right in the middle. That is Saul's kingdom while he was king. The green was where David expanded it. That's where it begins to push out the limits as he is conquered, as he is successful, and he brings more people into the kingdom of Israel. And then you go out into the pink area, you get into Solomon's reign. You start looking at how it expands to that point. And you get to where, if you look at the very top of that map, you see that Solomon's kingdom goes clear to the Euphrates River. Again, we're not talking about a lot of Solomon's today, but it's interesting as you look at this kingdom being expanding to the Euphrates River, because Genesis 15 tells us in the Abrahamic covenant that what is that landmass, that promise that God gave us of a land? It would go north is to the Euphrates River. So that's where we get all the battles, we get all the tension in the Middle East, all the crisis is taking place, because there's this battle over who owns the land. So as we look at a picture of modern-day Israel versus that time back there, you can look at the southern part of the tip of David and Solomon's kingdom, and it pretty much aligns with modern-day Israel. But where it gets interesting is you start moving north. If you look at the green, the Solomon and David's kingdom, you have the Dead Sea right in the middle of that green-purple area, and yet if you look at the other map, the modern-day map, it is the eastern border. The Dead Sea is the eastern border of the modern-day land. As you continue north, you see, again, Solomon's land goes clear to the Euphrates River. You start getting up there, you're talking about Lebanon and Syria. If you look at that green area, shows the city of Damascus. That's actually in Syria now. So there's just a big difference between what is taking place in modern-day land versus what was happened at the time of the United Kingdom. This is the United Kingdom. Actually, it gets divided right after Solomon, and there is a 7-year period right before David takes over where there is also a divided kingdom. We'll get into that a little bit later on, but there's a civil war that takes place, but we'll talk about that more as we go. So that's kind of a picture of the world situation, what's going on with the land masses, who owns what. So it's kind of interesting as we kind of put all that together and we start mapping out where we're going. So we're jumping into 1 Samuel. We're in 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 3. It begins with the account of Elkanah and Hannah. Now, Elkanah had 2 wives. I know that's always weird. You look back at the Old Testament, you see the situation where guys had 2 wives, and it wasn't something that God never said. He never said, hey, everybody should have 2 wives, but for some reason, God allowed it during that time period. Maybe it was for the expansion and growth of the nation, but Elkanah had 2 wives. He had a wife named Peninnah, and she was able to bear children. She also had a wife named Hannah, and Hannah was barren. She could not have children. So in 1 Samuel 1, we see Hannah at the temple. And she has gone to the temple, and she is wailing before God. I mean, she is just crying out to God, God, please give me a son. If you give me a son, I will dedicate him to you. He'll belong to you for his entire life. But God, I would like, open my womb. Please let me have a son. Well, Eli the priest is there at the temple. And he hears Hannah wailing, and he thinks she's drunk. He thinks it's just started way too early in the day. Like, what is going on with you, woman? Get out of here. At least save face a little bit. Stop your wailing and crying. Act at least a little bit civilized. And she explains to him, no, I'm not drunk. I am barren. I'm praying to God to give me a son. And Eli hears this, and he goes, God has granted you your prayer. You will have a son. And so Samuel is born. He is dedicated unto the Lord, just like Hannah said. He's given to God for his entire life. And then in 1 Samuel 2, we get to read Hannah's prayer. I'm not going to read it for you now, but I encourage you to take the time to read it. What's really interesting about Hannah's prayer is that she spends the entire prayer praising God for what he has done. It's very little about the joy of having a son. It's really about her joy in the Lord. I think it's a great lesson for us. Our joy should be in the Lord for all the things he provides for us, not to we get so excited about one specific thing that we think God has given us, but to really just recognize all the things that God has given us. Our joy is in him for all that he is and all that he has done for us. Now, Eli had 2 sons. They were wicked. In fact, if you look in the NIV in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12, NIV says they were scoundrels. They just had no regard for the Lord. They didn't follow after him. They didn't pay attention to him. So God just basically rejected Eli's sons as priests. And so that's when Samuel enters into the picture. And if you've ever read children's stories on the Bible, Samuel's one of the classics. I mean, you have Samuel who's laying in bed, and he hears this voice and calling out to him, and he runs to Eli because he's there. Remember, he's been dedicated to the Lord. He's living at the temple with Eli. He runs to Eli and says, Lord, what do you want? What do you want? And Eli says, I didn't say anything. So Samuel goes and lays down. And again, he hears a voice. And so he runs to Eli and says, what can I do? What do you need? And Eli says, I didn't say anything. Third time, Samuel goes back and he's laying in bed. He hears this voice and he goes to Eli, and Eli says, that's God speaking to you. Just tell him that you speak, for your servant listens. And so God lays out the plan for Samuel, to what he wants to be, what he wants from him, the calling of Samuel into full-time ministry. That takes place in 1 Samuel chapter 3. So that gets us through 1 Samuel 1 through 3. We get to 1 Samuel chapter 4, and we have trouble in Israel. The ark has been captured by the Philistines. The temple at that point, the Ark of the Covenant, took place in Shiloh. That's where it was located, or Shiloh, as the Jews called it there. Pam and I actually visited Shiloh 3 years ago when we were in Israel. Here's a picture of that. And so Shiloh as we often call it today, is where the Ark of the Covenant was held. It contained the Ten Commandments, very important piece of equipment, obviously, in Israel's history and for their religious worship. And the Philistines captured it. And so when they captured it, this Shiloh was the center of worship for all of Israel. This was the place where everybody gathered. So the ark captured by the Philistines, Eli hears about this. He is the priest. He hears, oh no, they've stolen the Ark of the Covenant. He falls over in his chair backwards, breaks his neck, and dies. I mean, he's so shocked, he's so upset, he's so distraught over the Ark of the Covenant being stolen, and so he dies. But then the Philistines have the Ark of the Covenant. And you see the map there where they just traveled all around with the Ark of the Covenant. They had it for 7 months. Now, what do you think happened during those 7 months? God was not happy that the Philistines had stolen the Ark of the Covenant, and so he made life miserable for them. So 7 months passed. They're trying to pass along from town to town to town. They're trying to figure out who can hold on to this thing, because it's just making a mess of every city it goes to. And finally, the Philistines, after 7 months, they contact the Israelites and say, can we get this thing back to you? It wasn't like the Israelites attacked them and said, hey, we're going to take it from you. No, the Philistines wanted to give it back to them. Here, get this thing out of our sight. It is destroying us. Please take it back from you. So the ark is returned to Israel. Samuel subdues the Philistines. But because not only do we have Eli's sons, who are scoundrels, who are wicked, Samuel has sons, but they're wicked before God. They do not follow. They have no regard for the way of the Lord. And so now the people of Israel, they're fed up. They're like, this is ridiculous. We had the scoundrels of Eli. Now we got the scoundrels of Samuel. We want a king. It's like Samuel's like, what? Wait a minute. We go back and we know from Exodus chapter 15 that God declares that he is the king of Israel. He is the forever king of Israel. Samuel gets angry. He's like, no, you can't ask for a king. You have a king. I am your judge. We will get another judge for you. And people say, no. All the other nations, they have kings. And everything's under control with them. And we're just a mess right now. We got a bunch of wicked guys. We want a king. So God tells Samuel, we'll get him a king. You see, God wasn't actually against them having a king. He just knew that there was going to be some repercussions, some ramifications if they did have a king. We read that in 1 Samuel chapter 6, verses 6 through 9. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 6 through 9. But when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. See, a human king is not something that is honoring to God. Human kingship, as one scholar put it, is theologically inappropriate, but practically necessary. So Israel wanted a king, God gave them a king. It's an act of rebellion that God works with, but he says, okay, we're going to make this work for you. It's going to apply to, we're going to make it apply to you, and you're going to understand what a king does, but we'll give you the king that you desire. So we come to 1 Samuel chapters 9 to 15. Samuel now anoints Saul to become the new king. Saul is he's a big, tall, handsome guy. He is head and shoulders above everybody. I mean, he's a picture-perfect king. He's the guy you look at and say, that guy should be king. I mean, he's just stronger than everybody, better looking than all the other guys. And Saul becomes king. And Saul rescues Israel. He makes everything better for them. They're like, okay, see, we wanted a king. Look, we got a king. It's all working out really well for us. But then Saul starts disobeying God. He doesn't destroy the Amalekites as he's supposed to. He goes and seeks out a medium rather than waiting on God and following his orders. And so Samuel rebukes Saul, and God ultimately rejects him as king. So 1 Samuel 16 comes along, and Samuel anoints David to be the next king. Now, I don't know if you remember that story, again, from some of the children's stories you read, but God sends Samuel to the home of Jesse. And he says, we're going to show you I'm going to have you dedicate the new king from these sons of Jesse. And so all the sons line up, and Samuel goes down, and God says, not the one, not the one, not the one, not. So he gets to the end of all the sons, and God says, he's not here. Samuel looks at Jesse and said, do you have any more sons? Well, yeah, Jesse said, we got the run of the litter. We got the guy, he's out in the pastures shepherding the flock. He's too young, he's too small. He's definitely not who you're after. And Samuel says, bring him to me. And God says, this is the one. In fact, we know from 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7b, a very familiar verse, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. See, David was a man after God's own heart. We know that David makes mistakes. We're going to talk about those in just a moment, but he was a man after God's own heart. God looked at his heart and said, this is the man I want to be king. And so then we move quickly through the story, and David he's still shepherding the flocks. His brothers are fighting for the kingdom of Israel. They go up against the Philistines, and they had a strange custom back then. Rather than sending this army to fight against this army, they would say, okay, you pick out your best guy, we'll pick out our best guy, and whoever wins that battle, that's who we'll follow after. That's who we have to follow, we have to succumb to. So the Philistines had this guy named Goliath. I mean, history tells us he's probably close to 10 feet tall. I mean, he is huge. And so every day he comes out and he mocks the Israelites. Send out your best guy. Send out your best guy. And the Israelites are like, I don't want to go fight that guy. He's almost 10 feet tall. He's huge. And so they just keep backing up. And every day they get mocked by the Philistines and mocked by Goliath. But one day David comes to bring lunch to his brothers. And he hears this Goliath guy talking, spouting off. And David looks at his brothers, looks at the Israel army and says, whose army are you? Don't you belong to the Lord? I'll take care of that guy. So he takes 5 stones, he takes his slingshot, he swings it around, he nails Goliath right between the eyes, right here on the forehead, knocks him down, takes out his sword, cuts off his head, and the Philistines flee. They are out of there. And so Israel plunders them, they become in charge. And so David becomes famous instantly. Saul calls him and says, hey, I want you to come to my court. I want you to serve me. I want you to be around me. And there was a couple reasons for that. One, because David was successful at everything he did. Every time Saul sent him out to face new battles, David won. He was always victorious. But there's another reason. You see, Saul was now jealous of David because David was getting all this notoriety. He was becoming famous. And as that old saying says, keep your friends close, and your enemies closer. That's what Saul was doing. He was keeping his enemy closer because he was scared of David. And so, in fact, he got so distraught over what was going on with David, he actually tried to kill him twice, threw spears at him. And then Jonathan is entered into the picture. See, Jonathan is Saul's eldest son. Jonathan and David became the closest of friends. I mean, I'm not talking about just a friendship. I'm talking about friendship that is tighter than a brother. And so they just adored one another. And what's interesting about that, you see, Jonathan was the rightful heir to the throne. He is Saul's eldest son. He should be taking over the kingdom, and yet he sees God's hand upon David. He knows already this is the guy that God has ordained. This is the guy that God has set apart to be the new king of Israel. And he begins turning over that authority to him very early in the process. But once Saul tries to kill David twice, finally David says, I got to get out of here. This is just not a safe place to be. So David flees. He heads out of there. He begins to travel all over. We can hear that map. He went over to Philistia. He was all throughout the wilderness. You see him ending up there in En-Gedi. Pam and I went to En-Gedi 3 years ago. It's a beautiful oasis in the middle of the wilderness. Great place to be. But David traveled all over trying to flee Saul. But during that time period, Saul pursued him. Saul said, I'm going to kill this guy. I got to get rid of this guy. He's a threat to me. He's going to take over the kingdom someday. Didn't trust him. And so he continues to go after him, but twice, not just once, but twice, David had an opportunity to kill Saul. And twice, David spared Saul's life. So that was the amazing thing about this. David never pursued the throne. He never tried to usurp Saul's authority. He had such a loyalty for the king that God had placed in charge, and he was constantly letting Saul, I'm here to serve you. I want to serve you. And yet Saul, because of this demon inside of him and this fear and this paranoia, continually tried to kill David. And then one day, the Philistines, during a battle with the Israelites, Saul becomes mortally wounded, but he doesn't want to give the Philistines the privilege of killing him. He doesn't want them to mock him, so he falls on his own sword and he dies. And so we move on to 2 Samuel. That's kind of that weird split. Saul dies, time for 2 Samuel. We haven't really made a transition yet, so we move on to 2 Samuel. David is anointed as the king of Judah. If you remember back earlier, I told you that this is a united kingdom, and yet there was a 7-year period that it was not united. There was a split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. A civil war was taking place. Why? Because Ishbosheth, what an amazing name, Saul's youngest son. Saul had 4 sons, but the 3 eldest sons, Jonathan included, they all died in the same battle in which Saul died. But Ishbosheth was the youngest son, and he felt like he was a rightful heir to the throne. So he took over the northern kingdom, and he became king over that. And they had this civil war battle going on between David's men and Ishbosheth's men. But then ultimately, Ishbosheth is murdered, so David takes over the entire kingdom, becomes the united kingdom at that point, becomes king of Israel. David then conquers Jerusalem. You see, I think we think in our minds that Jerusalem was always the center of Judaism. Remember, it was back at Shiloh originally, and now there's this opportunity as David conquers Jerusalem to move everything to Jerusalem, make it the center of Judaism. As David defeats the Philistines, he brings the ark to Jerusalem, and this Jerusalem is established as the center of God's kingdom, the center of the Jewish faith, and then God gives his promise to David. 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic covenant, basically tells him, your house and your kingdom will endure forever. Let me read a passage from you about that. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 4 to 16. But that night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I've been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, God's talking to the prophet Nathan, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did in the beginning and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. This is the Davidic covenant. This is setting out the line of David. It's not only just Solomon, but continuing on, which will also become the line of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, and which that kingdom will reign forever. So as we move on to 2 Samuel, we get to 2 Samuel 8, verse through 24. We read all about David's conquest, again, the expansion of his kingdom we looked at earlier. He's just growing in power and in might. And then one spring, One spring comes along. It's a time when all the kings go to war. After the wet season. It's a time when the carts can go along, the roads that are there. And Joab and his commander in chief sends him out. They all go to battle except David stays behind. We don't know if he's tired, needs a break. I don't know what the situation is, but he stays behind. One day he's up on his castle, and he's walking around up there on the porch, and he looks out there and he sees this naked woman. Now, you may be asking, what's a naked woman doing out in the middle of the day? But actually, she's up on the roof of her home, and that's supposed to be a safe, secure place. It's where you would go to take a bath. So Bathsheba is up on the roof of her home taking a bath. David looks down at her. He sees her, and he doesn't love her. He lusts after her. He decided he wants this woman. And so he calls for her, and he has her come to his castle, and he makes love with her, and she gets pregnant. Only one problem with that. Bathsheba's married. Yeah, she's married Uriah the Hittite. And so David, when he finds this out and finds out Bathsheba's pregnant, he's like, oh no, what do I do? So Uriah is out on the front lines. He's fighting the battle for David, and David calls him back home and says, hey, come back home and spend some time with your wife, not telling him anything that's going on. See, David's thinking, oh, that's right. So Uriah will come home, he'll sleep with his wife, he'll say that Bathsheba's pregnant for Uriah. It'll all be fine. Except Uriah comes home because he's so loyal to David, he won't even go into his house and see his wife. Sleeps on the doorstep. He won't even go in there. So he goes back out to war. David calls him home again. No, we got to try this again. Doesn't work a second time. And so finally David gives up. And he tells Joab, he says, Commander-in-Chief, he said, okay, let's go out. Send Uriah to the front lines, the fiercest part of the battle. And then when the battle is at its very worst, he said, tell everybody to withdraw except for Uriah. And of course, Uriah is killed by the Philistines. And so David takes Bathsheba in. And you think it might have all gone well from there? It doesn't. You see, Nathan, the prophet Nathan rebukes David. Nathan comes to him and tells him a story. He said, David, there's this man who has this whole flock of sheep. Got all kinds of lambs. I mean, he decides to do a feast, but rather than taking one of his lambs, he goes next door to this other house where there's only one lamb. He takes that lamb, slaughters it, and feeds his guests. And David looks at Nathan and says, that's ridiculous. That's awful. That man ought to be killed. And Nathan looks at him and said, you the man. You did that to Uriah. You took away his one beautiful wife. You could have all the women throughout Israel. You took his wife as your own. And David repents. He feels terrible. We read Psalm 51. I won't read the whole thing, but there's just a beautiful section of this in Psalm 51. David writes, as a result of repenting over what he has done, he says, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. So Bathsheba becomes his bride, his wife, and then the next, as David moves on through, we're in 2 Samuel 8 to 24 still, Absalom is David's third son. Absalom is the most handsome man on the planet. I mean, David loved Absalom. He just adored him. He had this beautiful head of hair. Everything was perfect about him. People just adored him when they looked at him. And so, but Absalom had one little problem. Well, actually, it wasn't his problem. See, Amnon, who is David's eldest son, falls in love with Tamar, who is Absalom's sister, which would make him Amnon's half-sister. So Amnon falls in love with his half-sister Tamar, who is Absalom's full sister, and decides he wants to make love to her. And so he sets up a situation where Tamar comes to his room, and then he feigns like he's sick, and finally, when she rejects him, he rapes her. Absalom is furious. David's furious, but David doesn't really do anything about it. Absalom, though, says, I'm going to take care of this problem. So he waits a couple years. The right moment comes along. He finds an opportunity to actually kill Amnon. But then he knows he's in trouble with David. He knows he's in trouble with the Israelites, so he flees. He heads out of town. But David still loves Absalom. He wants that relationship. And so they work through this through messengers. They finally get an opportunity to reconcile and restore that relationship. Absalom returns home to Israel. But I think Absalom still carried this grudge against David, that he never did anything about the death of his sister Tamar, about the rape of his sister Tamar. He never did it. He never took action against it, never took action against Amnon, and Absalom had to do it himself. And so ultimately, Absalom carries out a conspiracy against David. Tries to usurp the kingdom, take over power. And he gets a number of people behind him, and so David starts realizing that, hey, there's an army of people that are trying to undermine me, trying to overthrow me. And so he flees. He heads out of Jerusalem. And so he's running for his life. Absalom's trying to take over authority. But then one day, Absalom is out riding on his mule, and he's riding underneath a tree, and that big, beautiful, thick head of hair that he has gets caught up in the branches. And some of David's men see that, and they contact Joab, David's commander-in-chief, his head military man, and Joab goes out and kills Absalom. David is distraught. He still loves Absalom, but he's able to return home to Jerusalem, be able to reestablish his kingdom, and be able to prepare for the next thing that God has in his life, which is turning over the kingdom to Solomon so that that temple can be built and the line of David continued on forever. So what's the takeaway from all this? I told you, it's a story. It's a 135-year story that we've just kind of flown through. God is far less interested in our outward appearance as he is in the condition of our heart. And while we still fail and fall short of his standard, God is in the business of using the ordinary, broken people to do extraordinary things. That's us, folks. God is looking at our heart, and he knows we're going to let him down. We know we're going to fail him. We know we're going to have shortcomings, but he uses us, despite our failures, despite our shortcomings, to do extraordinary things for him if we'll only offer ourselves to him. Let's pray together, all right? Father, thank you for this opportunity to look at this narrative, to understand this story from Samuel to Saul to David as we prepare to continue on with Solomon. And Father, help remind us that we don't have to be perfect before you. We are forgiven because of what your son Jesus did for us. That's the story of redemption that we've been looking at throughout this entire Old Testament thus far. That plan of redemption that God has for us. Help us understand that, embrace it, and grasp with it because of what Jesus did for us. We have an opportunity to be used in very powerful and special ways by you. So we'll remind you on Tuesday evenings at 7:30, we have our Goodbook Zoom Q&A. If you don't have the link to that, please send me your email address. I'll get you hooked up with that. We just have a great time to be able to connect together and ask questions and talk about this particular study and anything else in the Bible you might want to talk about. Thanks for joining us.